Hi, 11. Just listening to some of the comments that you gave me last week after the video I did going through one of your younger generation's answers. The feedback that I got suggested that people would really like to see an example of how you would write and structure an essay. So I'm not going to write out a whole essay. I'm just going to show you the approach that I would recommend for putting together your paragraphs. Okay, and I'm not going to talk about introductions because, as I said, I think that's something we can come back to. It's much more important that we focus on getting our points across about whatever the essay question is. So, because I know that probably most of you did do a Mr. Burling essay last year, because I believe that the whole of Year 10 was set it, but also he's a very prominent character, so I thought it would be a good one to start with. I'm just going to talk through how I would think about planning for a Mr. Burling essay. So what I've done is I have just picked out a selection of quotes from relatively near the beginning of Act 1 to write about Mr. Burling. Now, what is quite important for you to consider is when you are planning your essay, do you want your essay to be chronological? Okay, and this for me is always the biggest question. Now, I would suggest, what I mean by chronological, by the way, is that you write about what happens in the play as the play goes on. So you start with Act 1, then Act 2, then Act 3. Now, the kind of positives to doing an essay in that way is that you are just going to get clarity on covering the whole play. If this were coursework, you would have a lot more time to map out quite a nuanced essay and view of the play. The fact of the matter is that you are going to be writing an essay in an exam, and so the pros of doing it chronologically are that the examiner is going to see very, very clearly that you are covering the play. They're going to go tick box, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. They've covered the whole play. They have an interpretation of this character across the whole play. On the other hand, the kind of other way to do it is maybe to structure your paragraph so that you're talking about kind of themes. So you might have one paragraph on how Mr. Burling is a capitalist who wants to protect the interests of profit. Okay, so you might, use, for example, this quotation here from the beginning. We employers at last are coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected. And you might argue that by the end of the play, the reason that Mr. Burling doesn't want to kind of accept blame is because maybe that would be him admitting that the capitalist class are to blame for what happens to working class people. So you might map it out in that way. What I'm going to suggest is that if you want to do that, then you really need to do proper planning first, okay? And I personally feel like that's maybe the next stage once you have got it clear in your head, a kind of chronological interpretation of the play. So for me today, I've decided that I'm going to plan I'm going to write an essay chronologically. And so I'm going to start with a paragraph on Act 1, okay? Now, what I tend to do when I'm thinking about writing an essay is that I will kind of draw together, and it took me 5 minutes finding these quotations of scanning through just the beginning of the play, okay? And I like to do this kind of typing because I find it easier when I'm doing this is kind of a revision task. And there's PDF versions of an Inspector Calls online, so you can literally copy and paste the quotations. Now, when I was thinking about the beginning of the play, in my mind I was thinking, okay, Mr. Burling is very, very prominent in Act 1, so I think that I want to do 2 paragraphs on Act 1. And this is going to be the first one. So when I look at these quotations, I'm going to kind of pick out the things that I think go together well. So the idea that he has this rather provincial tone to his speech is interesting because he starts talking here about Gerald and Sheila's marriage. to this kind of business proposition, okay, that Crofts and Burlings are no longer competing but working together for lower costs and higher prices. And the fact that he says we employers are coming together to see that our interests are properly protected. Now, it's interesting that he talks about the Crofts and the Burlings as these two companies being kind of at an equal footing, working together. And he uses this pronoun we to talk about employers. And it's quite interesting that actually we know, because it says he's rather provincial in his speech, that he isn't from a kind of typically upper class family, okay? He's not working class, that's not what it's saying, but he isn't as kind of upper class. He doesn't have old money in the way that many business owners usually do, okay? So he's a bit more of a, we can infer, somebody who's come up in the world a little bit. That isn't to say that he was working class and poor, but he isn't on the same kind of footing. So it's quite interesting to me that he kind of comes from not necessarily the highest class in terms of his background, but that he's now talking, you know, all about working together across their class interests, okay, and the interests of capital. And I think this is a very, very revealing quotation for Mr. Burling, because it literally tells us that what he cares about is profit, okay? He cares about the interests of the employer, the interests of the business owner, okay? And so I'm starting to think about, there's quite a nice paragraph coming together about Mr. Burling right from the start of the play revealing himself to have these capitalist interests. He doesn't really care at all about the working class. But what's interesting is this bit here when he says, I might find my way into the next honours list, so a knighthood. For me, that's also interesting, because again, it links back to this. Why is he trying to make himself seem that way to Gerald? I would argue it's because he has a deep-rooted insecurity somewhere in him that he isn't good enough, okay, that he isn't successful enough, he's not higher class enough. So this rather provincial speech bit in the stage directions at the beginning leads me to think that. So I'm going to try and put together a paragraph now where I am arguing a somewhat nuanced argument that yes, Mr. Burling is a capitalist, but actually perhaps his kind of capitalism and his profit-seeking kind of, his obsession with profit-seeking comes from this insecurity that he is surrounded by people that are more kind of upper class than he is and more successful than he is. So I would start by saying, at the beginning of Act 1, Mr. Burling is introduced in the stage directions as being rather provincial in this speech. And already I've just written that down and I'm thinking, okay, I haven't actually started my paragraph by saying my point. So actually I'm going to go back and edit it and I'm going to bring this in later, okay? So I'm going to speak and think out loud as I go so you can see my thought process. So we need to put in our opening sentence what we actually want to say. So I'm going to think about that. At the beginning of Act 1, Mr. Burling is presented as a character who is deeply concerned with success, and more specifically, the success of employers and therefore the capitalist class, okay? So can you see that when I started, I hadn't kind of necessarily thought about how I was going to go on, and so I needed to go back and edit that. So now we've got a really clear point, okay? What I want to add into my point, though, is that there is this other kind of tension going on about his insecurity. So he's deeply concerned with success, more specifically the success of employers and therefore the capitalist class. However, Mr. Burling himself, and then we can bring this in, is introduced in the stage directions at the start of the play as being rather provincial in his speech. This suggests that Mr. Burling himself is not actually from a traditionally upper class business owning background, and that perhaps he has come into success and money. Okay, so we're bringing in a slightly more nuanced approach, okay, to this character. So we know from the beginning that he has this rather provincial speech, that maybe is part of the reason why he is so obsessed with making money. Okay. This might go some way to explaining why Mr. Burling is so concerned with his class position and the success of his business at the start of the play. Okay. So we want to bring in our kind of main point here, that he's a character who's deeply concerned with success, more specifically the success of employers and therefore the capitalist class. Mr. Burling's daughter, Sheila, is marrying into a clearly successful family. And Mr. Burling reveals what really matters to him in conversation with Gerald. He says he looks forward to the Crofts and Burlings no longer competing. And then we do ... because we don't want the whole quote, for lower costs and higher prices. Mr. Burling seems interested in the two families coming together purely for business. He is hoping to make more profit by the two capitalist ventures coming together. Perhaps he is especially concerned with this because he has an insecurity about his own class position due to his more provincial background. Okay, just spell checking that. So can you see that I've started to kind of weave these 2 points together? Okay, so I'm talking about the fact that yes, he is deeply concerned with success, but I'm bringing in a more nuanced reading of him, that his kind of his interests in profit might be somehow to do with this insecurity that he has about his own background. I'm going to end the paragraph here by thinking a little bit more in detail about this quotation, because I think this is a good opportunity to do a bit of language analysis, so we employers. Mr. Burling is very careful, though, to include himself very firmly in any discussions about employers. For example, he uses the collective pronoun we when discussing with Gerald Mr. Burling states, and then we can do a colon, we employers at last are coming together to see that our interests are properly protected. By using the words we and our, Mr. Burling is hoping that Gerald will see him on the same level, and that this will encourage the profit-based joining together of these two families. Now I'm just looking back at the word encourage, and I think I want to change it to something else. So by using the words we and our, Mr. Burling is hoping that Gerald will see him on the same level, and that this will, should we say, kind of seal the deal on the profit-based joining together of these two families. Mr. Burling is very careful, or very emphatic about the fact that employers' interests are the same as the interests of capital. And capital means money, okay? Showing himself from the start to be a character that is concerned with the success of his own business and the ruling class. Let's not call him the ruling class, actually, because he's not a kind of politician. He's a businessman. So let's say instead that he's concerned with the success of his own business and the capitalist class generally. And then we kind of want to end always. So I think we've ticked a lot of the boxes. We've made this comparison, haven't we, with Mr. Burling and Gerald. We've thought in a more nuanced way about what he might be thinking at the beginning of the play. And we want to now end by talking about what J.B. Priestley might have meant. Perhaps, or let's not say perhaps actually, let's be emphatic about this. J.B. Priestley opens the play in this manner to set Mr. Burling up as a character who does not consider the plight of the working class. Mr. Burling is presented as the ultimate capitalist. However, it is interesting that Priestley chose to make Mr. Burling somebody who isn't himself from a traditional upper class family. And then we can say something about a suggestion here. Perhaps this is intended to show, to make us feel some kind of empathy towards his character, as he feels somewhat insecure in his own class position. Okay, that's literally me thinking completely on the spot about what to write. But I hope that what that shows you, and I'm totally aware that when you're actually writing an exam, you're not going to be able to spend the amount of time on this as we are. But the point is that you should be able to prepare pretty much every topic that's going to come up, okay? So if you do get a Mr. Burling essay, you can always say, right, I'm always going to write my first paragraph about Mr. Burling being this character who's deeply concerned with success, and that he kind of protects the capitalist class, but that there is this underlying insecurity, okay? What I would like you to do now is to pause the video, looking at the paragraph, and then if you go to the task that I have set you on this bit of feedback, please spend a little bit of time completing that task, looking at this paragraph, and then there's going to be a second video where I'm going to be giving you feedback on the other tasks that you've done over the past couple of weeks. Okay, so pause the video and get on with the feedback task that I have given you.